Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am young Ben Franklin. Welcome to Franklin University. FU.
My God, you're crass.
That's John Adams. He has the temperament of a crab with crabs. And this is, of course, Franklin 101. Now, if you are new to the show, I urge you to go back and watch the previous episodes. It's going to give you a lot more background context that is necessary and required for you to understand everything that we're talking about. But if you like to live your life without context, then you are what I like to call the average American voter. You do you. I'd also like to add that if you have enjoyed the animations for the show, they're done. I have no more money to afford to actually provide them. But if you did like them, please show your support for the whole show by donating in the link in my bio. The funding is going to go to creating a cleaner product than what we currently have. And moving forward, my animations are unfortunately going to be limited to what I can actually piece together in iMovie and Google Slides. I make the best out of what I'm working with, just like your average teacher in public education. Now, on to the lesson. This lesson number 3, is called Boston Rebel. As usual, the primary source we are using is my album B. Franklin Corrected and Amended, which can be found on all streaming services. The song that we're going to be focusing on today is known as Boston Rebel. But before we do that, I'd like to lay out a little bit of the context that's required for you to have a full understanding of this story. As I previously mentioned, I was an apprentice to my brother James. Now, James Franklin had a printing business in Boston, and the printing business, you must know, is incredibly difficult. We worked long hours to convert ideas into words that can be read by hundreds of people. In essence, we're talking to more people than we talk to in a normal day. There's a lot of power with the press, power that has not been tapped into yet. The reality is that you are only as powerful as the people's willingness to listen. We're working long hours to produce stuff that sells. If people aren't interested, then they won't buy your work, which means you've wasted time, which equals money. That means newspapers are risky ventures. If people don't read your newspaper, you've wasted time and money. So the newspapers up until this point were sponsored by community institutions, so church, government. What could be problematic with the church and the government running your newspapers? John?
It would mean that they can control what's being said.
And what would they be worried about being said, John?
They'd be worried about criticisms against the government.
What's so dangerous about criticisms against the government?
Why are you asking me all these questions?
Well, I'm practicing Socratic dialogue, John. You're going to get my point across by answering my questions.
I know what Socratic dialogue is.
Then why are you so upset?
Because you want me to talk about how I suppress the ability for citizens to criticize the government.
Actually, no, I wasn't. But now that you mention it...
They were talking about overthrowing the government. The Jefferson fanboys wanted me gone. They were trying to get rid of me. The people elected me to lead them because I was the only one who could lead them. I was the only qualified candidate.
Why are you so angry?
They called me a hermaphrodite.
Why did that offend you?
What? Because it's not true.
All right, well, we've now successfully gone way off topic. You're talking about stuff that's like 80 years in the future of where we're at.
Then why did you get me started?
To prove my point. Thank you, John.
What?
As you can see, those who are in power want to maintain their power. So in my youth, in 1720, the church and the government wanted to maintain their control. By controlling the newspapers, they could ensure that their message was spreading. Naturally, writings which spoke out against the government or church were not allowed. And my big brother James Franklin did not like this. Considering the disaster that was the Salem witch trials and other issues which I'll address later, the younger community was over the control of the Puritan church. In 1721, when I was 15 years old, James Franklin set up the New England Courant, the first independent-minded newspaper in all the colonies, and its role was to attack the church through ridicule, humor. Modern satire was being pioneered in London at this time thanks to Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift, and it allowed people to be able to engage in valid points of criticism through humor. It kept the anger down unless you were the butt of the jokes, and James imitated this style. He took on all the literary elements of satire, imitation, exaggeration, metaphors, parodies, tongue twisters. After all, a little alliteration lesson lessens the literacy rates. Am I right? James's newspaper became a successful citadel of Enlightenment thought here, or coming from London. People had things to say about the church and the government. Now they had an outlet here in Beantown, where everyone kind of sounds like an asshole.
1722.
Genius without education is like silver in a mine. I had to work to reach my genius. As a printing apprentice to my brother James, I had ready access to the satires and the political writings of the Enlightenment. I taught myself to write by converting these essays into poetry. But the most essential experience was my involvement in my brother's titanic clash with the religious authorities over freedom of speech. How does a young and relentless runaway apprentice focus his attention on economic ascension? Political conventions, innovative inventions become such an iconic, enigmatic, eccentric. The thousand-scented witty man with 1,000 senses, worth 1,000 sentences, without question, the most stupendous $100 baller. Founding fathers, founding father. I was a lot smarter, hard-working, self-starter, a blue-collar brawler who couldn't afford Harvard, but by 14 had joined my brother in a paper war up in Boston. The Puritan tradition was waning and draining to the population whom they failed to contain. When James Franklin stated, "Man, it's insane if I complain. I'll be claimed as a sinner, named to fame, then hanged like them women from Salem whom they proclaim to be agents of Satan just for using their brains." Domination of religion gave James reason to rage. Put the quill to the page, paper became a haven for the men of a new generation. Newly formed natives born from the congregation. Separation of church and state was their sentiment. Questioning aggressive gentlemen of the Enlightenment began fighting with the church in feisty print. The rhetoric was rather bitter. James led the fight in it, and I was trying to be in the room where it happened. The room of the theoretical, satirical rappings, laughing at another minister / combatant. I took it all in, growing slowly maddened at the fact that I would probably be the best writer in this paper, the NEC. I tried to use my name, but James had forbidden me. I became Silence Dogood, a chick in her 50s.
Oh, you don't know about Silence Dogood? Well, even though James Franklin had the first independent-minded newspaper in all the colonies, that didn't actually mean that we were protected by freedom of the press. So when people wrote to independent papers in London, they would often write under pseudonyms or fake names, which basically protected them from being found by the government. Since this was the age of satire, these writers would not only take fake names, but they would create entirely new personas under these names. So it made for a much more engaging read. I decided to imitate this style. So my 16-year-old teenage boy self decided to be a tough-minded middle-aged woman. After all, what does a teenage boy know better than a middle-aged woman?
Wait, was that a joke?
A tough old gal with the eyes of an eagle who would find folly, sins, and all that was evil. Harvard was a bastion of pretension and ignorance. Ministers turned politicians are religious hypocrites. Girls are proud, dumb, and idle. Men would complain when men weren't allowing women education. We should help out all the widows, pay them what we can, and help out all those spinsters who needed a man. I kept at it. Every other week I had it. Front page of the paper, James was steadily attacking the government. But then they got real pissed. James implied that they were hesitant with pirates, so they tossed him in jail, leaving the paper high and dry with no one else to run it. Someone heard my wish. I came in, I wrote, I pitched, I sold. I was heating up in James, well, he was stuck in the cold. Now when he got out, James had himself a vendetta. A right to print openly without the fear of the censors. So he came on back and he started his crusade, and I wanted to aid. James said, no way! Since I saved the paper from being destroyed, I wanted it. So we were brothers fighting over a toy, and boy, don't you know what comes next? Need I even mention all the tension that began festering and fermenting? I told him I was too good with obnoxious condescension. The subsequent contention increased from this dissension. Multiple dimensions to the aggression I received. I was obnoxious. fascist for running the NEC successfully. And James himself felt a little ashamed. His itty-bitty little brother was claiming some fame, so he began verbal attacks, and then he would smack me. I would yap back, earning whacks and slaps way more savagely. Finally said,
I'm gone from this treatment and this town.
Boston sucks, so I was New York bound. I got into the harbor and I looked around. I said, fuck New York, take me further south. I ended up in Philly, much to my relief, a city with a bit of different religious lean. Thus begins our story, the rest is US history. The US is us, but I put the his in history. I put the his in history.
I put the his in history.
And the rest is history. I run away from Boston, become my wonderful Ben Franklin self. But my big brother James is forgotten about. Now make no mistake, James Franklin is a founding father. He set up the first independent-minded newspaper in all the colonies. And I learned a lot from his success, and I would take that to become successful in my own career. But I definitely also learned a lot from his failures. He didn't know when to stop pushing. He had a great idea and a great push for change, but he then just kept going, and he would hit them and hit them and hit them. Even when public opinion turned against him, he just kept going, and he lost. And so he's not remembered in history. You have to remember, people fear what's unknown to them. And the impact of change is unknown to people. So people fear change. So what's the lesson? If you're trying to enact change in your own life, and you have a great idea on how to do so, and you just keep going forward without having the wisdom to take a second and sometimes realize you need to take a step back in order to make sure that lasting change continues, but you then just keep going, and you fail, and that change doesn't happen, then what good were you?